us about why do online countering violent extremism strategies not work, and the case of digital jihad. So yeah, feel free to start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Let me share the screen. I hope you can see the slides right now. Again, thank you so much for having me today. So in my short intervention, I'd like to briefly explain why I believe that online countering violent extremism programs are not working, at least not as efficiently as widely believed. And in order to do so, I will refer mostly to the case of digital jihad. And before I do so, let me just briefly tell you about the very concept of countering violent extremism, which was created in the United States during the Barack Obama presidency. And it consists of all activities dedicated to fighting against radicalization, both online and offline. And when it comes to the online dimension, they usually consist of three aspects. First of all, awareness raising programs that are designed to increase the immunity, the resistance of societies to terrorist propaganda. We also have the dissemination of counter narratives that aim to mitigate the propaganda devices, propaganda methods usually used by terrorists. And finally, we have terrorist content removal, which are designed to prevent massive and easy access to terrorist content, so online audiences don't get inspired, radicalized by these materials. And in my presentation, I'll be focusing strictly on the content takedowns because they were presented by some stakeholders and some researchers in recent years as the most efficient, the key way of fighting against online terrorism and political violence. We have heard a lot that we succeeded generally in taking Salafi jihadist content down, and it stopped to be such a significant problem as it used to be 10 years ago. I would like to discuss this in greater detail, and I'll be referring exclusively to the surface web. So this area of the internet that's accessible from the search engines exclusively. And the reason is that when it comes to other dimensions of internet communication, such as social media, those content takedowns prove to be much more efficient. So I'll be not discussing this topic. And in order to explain why I think that those countering violent extremist programs are not as efficient as widely believed, I will refer to four case studies, for research projects that I realized since the end of 2020. They were all based on open source intelligence, and they were all dedicated to measuring changes in the information ecosystems maintained by different Salafi jihadist terrorist organizations. Either on the surface web, that's these are three of them, and in one case, I also investigated the dark web, to be more precise, the Onion router. So let me start with the first project that was carried out at the turn of 2020 and 2021, and the whole idea of this project was to verify those claims, indicating that we generally succeeded in fight against Salafi jihadist terrorist propaganda on the web, broadly understood. So I was interested and I wanted to create a snapshot of the information ecosystem of the communication channels run by Salafi jihadists on the surface web at the time. And it was a major surprise to learn that the whole communication, all the communication channels, both active and inactive, but still detectable, there were more than 330 communication channels accessible, including almost 100 standalone websites, 30 social media profiles, more than 150 file sharing services, and about 50 other means of communication. By other means of communication, I mean primarily encrypted communication apps such as Telegram, Rocket Chat, or similar. So it was a major surprise, given that according to some stakeholders, government authorities, it shouldn't be that big. And the biggest surprise was that, unfortunately, not of the violent extremist organizations under consideration were actively competed by stakeholders. You can see the example on the left, the account of the spokesman of the Taliban at the time, at the beginning of 2021, had more than 190,000 followers on Twitter, which was a surprise given the fact that the Taliban is actively cooperating with Al Qaeda. So the second project focused on the Islamic State alone. The Islamic State currently, and in the last 10 years, has been perceived as the primary target of content takedowns because of obvious reasons. So I wanted to see how its information ecosystem evolved under the pressure of content takedowns activities of the law enforcement agencies and other stakeholders. So at the beginning of 2021, based on the same set of open source intelligence methods, I was able to discover more than 130 communication channels run by the group or its followers, including 28 standalone websites, 9 social media profiles, 74 sharing services, and 19 other means of communication. You can see the general diagram visible on the left. The green brackets are those that were accessible. The red ones were inaccessible but still identifiable, and the white ones were not monitored because they were, for instance, encrypted communication apps or file sharing services. But generally speaking, it was a quite a large information ecosystem maintained by the group that's the primary target of content takedowns, so it shouldn't be that developed. However, the biggest surprise was made by the fact that in the second part of the project, that was carried out 6 months later in June 2021, I carried out the second round of the investigation, and I've learned that the size of the whole network, propaganda dissemination network, almost tripled to 386 communication channels. You can see again the diagram on the left. And it consisted of 58 standalone websites, 12 social media profiles, more than 280 file sharing services, and 34 other means of communication. Mostly these were encrypted communication apps, Telegram, Freema, or Rocket Chat. So it was a major surprise because in just half a year, the group that's been actively engaged. Its content has been actively taken down by a variety of different stakeholders, tech firms, government authorities. Was capable of developing its presence on the surface web, this part of the internet that's the easiest to access for everyone interested. So it was quite important. The third project that was carried out between 2020 and June 2022 was dedicated to learning how those things look like on the dark web. That's one of the most under-researched areas when it comes to online terrorism and political violence. And I wanted to verify those claims, indicating that there is an ongoing migration of terrorists from the surface web to the dark web because they are actively and successfully taken down on the surface web. So as of June 2022, the whole Salafi jihadist information ecosystem consisted of only 6 websites, onion websites. But the interesting part is that they were full of terrorist propaganda. There were thousands, tens of thousands of propaganda productions available through these websites. However, they mostly served as a backup, as backup communication channels whenever the surface web domains were blocked. And aside from them, there were also 4 microblogs and image boards that contained mostly Salafi jihadist chatter. They served as hotspots of terrorist communication. For instance, Islamic State followers were looking for recruiters on the dark web, or they wanted to contribute financially to the group on those boards. And last but not least, the dark web was also utilized at the time for the purpose of acquiring propaganda through torrent search engines that are easily findable on the Onion router. And the fourth project, this is the final project that is not completed. It is still ongoing currently here in Italy at the Time Center. This is the project, the VOMAP project, that aims to map the evolution of the information ecosystem of major and minor terrorist organizations on the surface web, and also those communication channels that are visible from the surface web. And you can see the diagram. These are the early findings, by the way. So those numbers may change, but the general situation is visible on the left on the social network analysis chart made in Gephi. So generally speaking, in the autumn, in the second half of 2023, based on open source intelligence, web intelligence methods, it was possible to identify almost 1,000 individual communication channels hosted, operated, run by different Salafi jihadist terrorist organizations, including primarily Islamic State and Al Qaeda. And it's not a surprise that Islamic State maintained the biggest propaganda dissemination network, composed of almost 500 communication channels. In terms of Al Qaeda, it was a bit less, but also more than 350. And obviously, the project also considered other minor, less important organizations, such as the Turkestan Islamic Party. And on the one hand, it shows how lively, how the dynamic is the whole propaganda dissemination network still on the surface web, and it's generally easy to find those websites. But on the other hand, it also shows the workforce behind the propaganda production machine of those groups. And just within half a year, within the project, I coded more than 18,000 individual propaganda productions released on the surface web, primarily by Islamic State and Al Qaeda. So generally speaking, this content is easily available. So when we move to the conclusions, so what are the conclusions of these projects? So first of all, when we heard that the terrorist content takedowns are working, obviously they are working on the social media, because the social networks were much more successful in quickly identifying and taking terrorist content down. Unfortunately, it does not apply to the surface web. So when we are talking about those environments that are visible, accessible from search engines, and such content is massively and easily accessible in just a matter of seconds, or sometimes minutes. So it raises a problem of the efficiency of those content takedowns. And when we look at the dynamics behind the struggle between the governmental authorities and tech firms on the one hand, and terrorist organizations on the other hand, it kind of reminds of the battle against the mythical Arnian Hydra, where whenever we take one terrorist communication channel down, another to pop up elsewhere on the internet in a matter of hours, or in a matter of sometimes days. So the practical effect of the content takedowns usually is related to blocking these communication channels for just several hours. So at the time, those followers, those people interested in such content, usually refer to the dark web, because there are backup communication channels accessible there. So the practical effect is unfortunately not that visible. And there are some voices recently emerging in the scientific community, indicating that again, when we look at the struggle, it reminds of a digital arms race in which there is always an alternative for terrorist communication, and these content takedowns are forcing terrorists to improve, to introduce innovation, so they are always one step ahead from law enforcement agencies. And unfortunately, it can be identified such a trend. I'll cover it in a second. But aside from it, the struggle also shows that there is a lack of global PCVE cooperation currently visible. The digital jihad, online terrorism, and political violence generally is a global problem because internet is a global medium. But unfortunately, we see different states or different organizations applying differentiated approaches to even the most basic questions, such as what is the terrorist content? And I'll just give you two examples. On the one hand, we have the Taliban currently ruling Afghanistan, which has been at least, which was considered until 2021 a violent extremist organization. The Taliban actively cooperates with Al Qaeda. But how are we going to address the problem of Taliban Al Qaeda cooperation on the internet, which is still ongoing? And is it even possible to address this problem if the Taliban is ruling the country? It is one problem. The second problem is visible since October the 7th, since the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel. And whilst Hamas has been perceived as a terrorist organization by Western governments, there are some governments in the world that perceive Hamas as a resistance movement, and effectively, the propaganda produced by Hamas on the internet is easily accessible on multiple internet platforms. And finally, we have the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect, that's one of the side effects of content takedowns. The Streisand effect is based on a perceived increased value of the censored content on the internet, which forces some internet users to re-echo, to share the content that's been taken down on the internet. And unfortunately, we could see similar reactions to terrorist content being taken down because some internet users just dislike censorship on the internet. And we could see it, for instance, in 2014, 2015, when even totally unaffiliated internet users that do not follow the radical agenda of Islamic State, they tended to share their propaganda just for the sake of fighting against censorship. So about terrorist innovations that I mentioned a moment ago, some of the most important ones in the last 4 or 5 years include the introduction of the anti-crawling and anti-DDoS techniques at terrorist-operated websites, which means that they are much harder to be taken down by cyber attacks, for instance. We can also see that they are increasingly using more professional cyber criminal infrastructure. It means that they are increasingly more resilient to law enforcement agencies' activities. We can also see that they have started to use QR codes for the sake of redirecting followers, supporters to other alternative communication channels whenever their propaganda is being taken down. You can see the example on the left. This one originates from the Ilan Foundation website run by Islamic State. We can also see that they are using they started to use the Ethereum name system, which is a alternative for the domain name system, being the primary name system for the internet, which also means that it's harder to take this content down, to block these websites on the internet. And other innovations include, for instance, link directories, which redirect followers to other less visible on the surface web hotspots of terrorist communication. They also use strange punctuation of some of the key terms used by jihadis because it allows to hide from the automated content detection software. Or finally, they even suggest to modify some operating systems in order to avoid content takedowns by the law enforcement agencies. So, what are the conclusions? First of all, let me say that online countering violent extremism in the current form on that surface web is in some cases, it's not only inefficient because the content is still there, but it is also counterproductive. It may be counterproductive, let me be more precise, because when we're looking at the whole dynamic happening on the side of the terrorists, so they are taking some risks to share the content, to publish propaganda on the internet. And this means that they are endangering themselves and they are leaving some traces. And whenever we look at the current approach of removing all those traces, all those communication channels, banning them on the internet, it means that we are also removing the traces of terrorist activities that can be potentially used by law enforcement agencies. And in some cases, there is also a risk that we are removing the evidence that's necessary to subsequently prosecute those people. So if we look at the history of the demise, the crisis experienced by the Islamic State around 2017, 2018, 2019, when it comes to its online propaganda campaign, we see that there was one other factor that contributed to this crisis. Some stakeholders, some researchers argued that it was mostly because of the content takedowns, but the true change, the crisis has been caused primarily by the fact that the Islamic State, since I think until 2016, has lost more than 100 media operatives, media mujahideen as they call them. So the people responsible for producing and disseminating propaganda, these were highly skilled professionals. So this workforce and the know-how, they lack the workforce and know-how since 2016 onwards, and this was the core reason why the Islamic State experienced a crisis since 2016. So if you look at this history, there is a potential role to be played by digital forensics. So if the content takedowns are not efficient, will be efficient. So my point is that first of all, let me say that I'm not saying that content takedowns are not important. They are important. They should be carried out, especially at the popular hotspots of internet communication. But when it comes to those more hidden communication channels, which are still regrowing on the internet, we are still playing this whack-a-mole game. There, we should take a look at the potential offered by the digital forensics. So let's gather evidence. Law enforcement agencies should gather those traces, analyze them, and try to identify people responsible for sharing propaganda, because those traces are there. So effectively, it means that the most efficient way is related to investigating those communication channels and trying to apprehend, detain media mujahideen. And those examples are already there. For instance, there is an example of the Al-Tawhid publication, pro-Islamic State group that was active up until 2021 on the internet. And when some of its members were arrested in 2021 by FBI, the whole group went silent, which was a huge blow for the propaganda production capabilities of the Islamic State at the time. So I think that that's it for today. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Are there any questions in the room? Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions, and we are kind of running a bit over time. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank
and
you
that
so much.
concludes the session.
Thank you.